Good day. In this, I'm going to share with you a number of stories that are dangerous to use in job interviews. Okay, the number one story is you should think twice before using job interviews are the ones which are overly personal. Stories such as your financial struggles or maybe a divorce and stuff like that. And even further, whenever you're talking about something personal, you basically open up to your interviewer. Okay, so you could also have something like a setup. The interviewer is asking you, hey, what makes you laugh these days? And some people would rather go on the personal side, hey, my family, my 2 kids and stuff like that. Nothing wrong saying that, keeping in mind that, you are opening up to your interviewer, and what happens is the next question might not be as comfortable. It will be, hey, but have you had any shortcomings as of recently? And then because you opened up previously, you're going to have a tendency to open up as well right now. And you may talk about stuff, I don't know, maybe you failed in your previous role and now you want to move on to another company, which you wouldn't otherwise share with them, right? So overly personal stories are completely inappropriate, right? The financial struggles, the divorce and stuff like that. But even when you talk about personal stories, keep in mind you are vulnerable in job interviews. The second type of story is one to avoid using in job interviews would be stories that are no longer relevant. Okay, what does it mean relevant? Well, if you have a career that spans over the past 30 or 40 years, something that happens, when you were a fresher is rather irrelevant when you're applying for a new job, right? So stories that are too old, might not be as relevant as you might expect, right? Now, I know, there's various candidates who say, hey, yes, Dan, but I don't have any recent stories that are extremely relevant to the role that I'm applying for. But you should really spend a bit more time on understanding how to sell yourself best in these circumstances, because what happens is if all your stories are old for the role that you're applying for, then chances are you also can be looked at as overqualified for the role that you're applying for. You're too senior, right? So then how do you strike a balance here? Well, maybe you'd want to use a combination of older and newer stories in the same answers, assuming communication is your strength. So various strategies you'd want to employ, but stories that are too old can also be irrelevant for the purpose of job interview, and you should avoid using them altogether. The third type of story that's not particularly efficient in job interviews are extracurricular activities. Your charitable work and stuff like that. Now, I'm not saying you should never say this in a job interview, not at all. Actually, pitching, a behavior every once in a while with your third interviewer, yes, that works. But some people have a tendency to overly rely on extracurricular activities in order to sell themselves as the best candidate for the job, right? It might work for freshers, maybe had a side project that was extremely interesting and relevant for the type of, subject matter expertise required for your role. But generally speaking, employers and interviewers are interested in your professional experiences for the role, right? The fourth type of example you'd want to pay particular attention to sharing in job interviews would be some questionable activities you've been part of in your previous roles. Okay, so I'm primarily speaking here about a scenario that you are coming from a non-FANG company applying into a FANG company. So what you should be super careful with is about fitting into a culture of honesty, right? And it's a lot easier than you think to share stories such as when you corner the customer into a deal, into a credit line, for example. I had a banker who said this, or you sold a business unit for being afraid of getting sued because they did something highly dubious. So there's all sorts of shady stories, shady events that might not work to your advantage interviewing, especially with FANG companies, right? So if there are some dubious, some questionable behaviors in the stories you'd want to share, then think twice before sharing them with a company that puts a lot of emphasis on ethics and principles and stuff like that, right? Number six, I'd like to share with you something that happens in individual contributor roles primarily, that they have a tendency, some individual contributor roles, for example program managers, have a tendency to share stories of manager level roles, and especially in conflict situations. For example, an individual contributor role does not have the main goal to manage teams, to manage people, right? So when asked about a conflict, you're not expected to talk about how you manage a team of individuals to get along together, right? But rather, the time when you diffused, you had a conflict with someone else, all right? So individual contributor roles should stay away from using examples from manager level roles. What's the risk, you might ask? The primary risk here is that you might suggest that you are overqualified for the job that you're applying for, because if you have manager level expertise, chances are you've been one level up, right, in this. And you might come across as not genuinely interested in that specific role, but rather you'd be interested in quickly moving on to more interesting types of opportunities, right? So if you're an individual contributor role, if you're applying for an individual contributor role, stay away from sharing manager level examples, right? Next example I wanted to share with you is, again, these are things that happen with people that I work with, right? These are stories that I see in candidate story banks, of which I have plenty to analyze. And the other scenario I'd want to pay particular attention to, again, this relates to hands-on versus hands-off types of roles. So when you are applying for a hands-off role that's assumed to be a bit more senior than a hands-on role, you should limit the number of examples you use as a hands-on candidate, right? So, for example, if you're applying for a hands-off PM, I don't know, at Apple, for instance, you should stay away from talking about your hands-on experience. Why would this be? Well, because you might come across as underqualified, as overly technical for the type of aptitudes and competencies, leadership, influence, strategic impact, and non-technical execution that would be core to your role, right? So if you're hands-off, stick with the hands-off expertise as your primary way to sell yourself, rather with the hands-on, right? If you don't know whether your role is hands-on or hands-off, better ask first, right? And last, I think I forgot to mention about this, is something that's extremely common in job interviews. Candidates who have a tendency to share some events, some traumatic events they couldn't get over, such as conflicts. You didn't get along with your previous boss. And what happens here is, when someone asks you, hey, tell me about the time when you did not get along with someone, your reflex is to think about, hey, when you didn't get along with your boss. But the problem is, if you cannot get over that, and that event still haunts you, the problem is chances are you'll come across as overly negative and as blaming others. Hey, it's also my fault, but it's also their fault, right? Whereas in job interviews, this never flies. Okay, so when you're talking about conflict, you should emphasize on your ability to listen and your empathy and your data-driven approach to resolve these things. So if you have some traumatic events, such as conflicts are the most common, or you basically hated someone very much and you couldn't get over that, stay away. Consider better examples to share in these job interviews. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.